Hello and welcome back to Rev State School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, joined by Jess again. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. We're talking about the wonderful world of social comparison, which everybody deals with. Envy, social comparison, comparing ourselves to other agents, comparing people or ourselves to people's highlight reels on Instagram. So that's what we're going to dive into today. So I think maybe even before we jump in, is this something that you have dealt with or deal with?
I think every human deals with it, right? Like comparison is the thief of joy. And so if you let yourself sit in it, it's going to make you feel bad about yourself no matter what, because there's always somebody that's going to have more success or money or a nicer house or more clients than you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Inevitable.
I think if you feel it, you're human. Like if you don't feel it, you're probably, well, you could be human, but maybe touching on psychopath. Like I think honestly, if you don't feel this at all, it's just so abnormal, regardless of the stage that you're at. And the thing that always got me, I remember being a very rookie real estate agent and thinking to myself, okay, well, if I could get to, 100K in GCI, everything would be set. And then once that's hit, the goalpost shifts and it needs to be 250. And then that changes to 5. And it never really ends. And I always think back to that, thinking to myself, when I first started, it was always 100K GCI. And that never, when that moment came, nothing changed other than the goalpost. And so I think that everyone, especially in real estate, we focus on this can definitely contribute to a lot of unhappiness, but a lot of it's also just driven by the fact that we spend a lot of our time on social media too. But excited to jump into this topic because I think that there's a lot that we can unpack. So what are some of your first thoughts when you're thinking through how to overcome this concept of social comparison and envy?
Well, I mean, I have a few sort of tools that I try to live by. But I guess I almost want to say, like, just to reiterate what you were saying, like, it's very normal if you feel this way. You hear these concepts like, oh, the only person you compare yourself to is the you of yesterday. And, just only focus on your own work. And that's true, but you're just so surrounded by other people. I think it's normal because from a human nature standpoint, if you can sort of know where you stand in the herd, like, it's probably going to aid in your survival. So looking at it from that lens, like knowing that it's a completely normal feeling, but then of course, us, we always like to talk about action, like what's going to come from that feeling. So, for me, if I find myself obsessing over, someone else's success or someone else's Instagram post or what have you, which I actually really don't do very often anymore. But I know a lot of people do struggle with this. Like, ask yourself what you're envying about that person and then take an action. So for example, like let's say you're a real estate agent and you're always looking at this one real estate agent or a few real estate agents that seem to have the best TikTok videos, or maybe they have really good Instagram reels and you're like, damn, like everyone's doing video these days. Like I know I should be out there doing video. This person's doing such a great job. Like, why can't I? And I think if you scroll all the way to their very first video, like do it, you're probably not going to be very impressed, right? You're seeing the byproduct of that person's effort and time compounded to the place that they are today. So remind yourself that everybody's a beginner. Everybody has to start somewhere. And if you're envying the product, put in the work yourself, right? Oftentimes, if we see like videos, and I'm using this example, but you're focused on the video, make your own. Just start somewhere, right? I think a lot of people aren't afraid of trying or failing. They're afraid of failing in front of an audience. They don't want people to sit there and judge them, but somebody would have judged this first person's video too. So just put yourself out there and do the thing if you find yourself ruminating on, say, videos, for example.
That's a really interesting take, is like using it as motivation in a sense versus social comparison. I really like that. Have you ever heard of Dunbar's number before?
I don't think so.
So Dunbar's number is like, so it was I guess a scientist, social scientist, who put together this study and determined how many people somebody can realistically have close relationships with, or a reasonably close relationship with. And the number is 150. And so this study, I think it sparked a whole bunch of discussion around, and this is, don't worry, we're going to get to social comparison through this study, but it talked a lot about how we evolved as humans. And we evolved with this whole notion that we can stay in touch with a tribe, which would be, say, up to 150, 200 people. Now, when you think about that, if you're in a tribe of 150 to 200 people, you're going to be the best of that group at something, right? You're going to be the best at something in that group. And then now, of course, we're in the world of social media where we're comparing ourselves to the world. And so our brains just haven't adapted to handle this. And even, if you look at a lot of the studies and you look at where happiness has really started to drop, it's always comes up very, very consistently around like 2007, 2008. And that, of course, is when the smartphone was released. And so there's definitely some correlation here. And I think most of us understand that a lot of this social comparison is going to come by way of social media and limiting our use in a certain sense, but we also have to use it in our business. But I really like how you mentioned this concept of motivation. One thing that I wrote down is this concept of when you see somebody doing well in video or listing a lot of homes, wish them well. Just wish them well. A little note in your own mind that says, I hope that listing sells. I hope they get more listings from this video. They're doing a great job. And this little shift is going to change us from feeling envious to feeling inspired. And I think that really is one of the main concepts here when we're comparing ourselves to others. We're thinking what they have and what we don't. We're coming from kind of a place of lack, where if we wish them well, you're going to notice like almost instantaneously, this is like an instant fix for social comparison, is anytime you see somebody doing well and wish them more success. And it's just shocking how that can impact our own psyche.
I love that. And it's so true. I always try to congratulate people in my mind for things too, or if someone did something and I think, wow, that's amazing. That must have been a lot of hard work. And I have kids, so I say that stuff out loud a lot too, because I try to help my children learn to, be happy for other people's success as well. But I think the opposite mindset comes from a scarcity mindset, right? There's not enough resources. If they get a deal, that means I won't. And when you have that mindset, you're going to look at other people's commission checks or other people's deals or client roster as a threat to your own, instead of, as you've said, like a motivation to go out there and find your own, because there's enough for everybody.
There really is. There really is. And I think that I guess, how do you think through this with an agent saying, okay, I get it, but there's more and more agents coming into the world of real estate and there's only a certain number of transactions that occur. So how would you kind of help an agent through that sort of limiting belief?
It's true. There are only a certain number of transactions. And there are, let's say, at least in my market, like 10% of the agents doing most of the business. So we can only control ourselves in any aspect of life. You can't control someone else's behavior. I certainly know that as a mother. So if you're, whenever I would coach agents, that's what I try to talk about is let's control your own actions. And how do you do that? There's sort of like 4 steps I look at to sort of combat this scarcity mindset or envy or however you want to look at it. Number 1, I think it's really important to be informed about your own metric. So firstly, know your metrics. How many people are in your pipeline? How many deals have you done this month, this quarter, this year? How many did you do last year? You need to know these numbers and you need to reference them so that you're fresh at any point in your quarter or year. You understand sort of where you are and how does that compare to your past performance? And then that will help inform your future performance. So that's key. I think a lot of agents don't necessarily track their own numbers. So you can't really know where you stack if you don't actually know your own numbers. That's important. Like any business, right? You gotta track metrics. Number 2 is keeping yourself accountable. This is absolutely huge. And I think, as we've talked about before on this podcast, you're kind of a picture of the 3 to 5 people that you hang out with the most. So if you can find somebody who's like-minded and goal-oriented, or maybe in the same phase that you're in, use them to help you to keep yourself accountable to whatever goals you have, or hire a coach. Like we do a lot of this accountability coaching here at Rev, and it's one of the things I think people value the most in a coach is somebody that can keep you accountable. And then the third one is pretty simple, but I think a lot of people forget to do this, especially as their career progresses, but it's celebrating your own progress, right? Like, where are your wins this day, this week, this year? I think it can be a very negative business sometimes because the highs are highs and the lows are lows. But something small that my husband and I used to do together, because we were both in real estate, is whoever did a deal would take the other person out for dinner. And we did that for years because we wanted to keep the excitement and the happiness and the sort of positive feelings around doing a deal. And, he's been in this business 25 years. So it's been a long time, but we still try to celebrate those wins. And then I said there was 4. So my 4th one is committing to gratitude. Are you somebody that practices gratitude like in a daily or weekly way?
Yeah, yes and no, like in the sense that I've tried and then I've fallen off and I've tried again. Probably a lot of people can resonate with that.
Yeah.
But I actually saw this really interesting TikTok about it yesterday, and it was this girl, and she was just doing a TikTok on I can drive a car, I can go anywhere, right? I can go to the grocery store, I can buy anything, like just these standard things. And I just watched that TikTok and I felt a lot better about it. So what's your practice when it comes to gratitude?
Yeah, I do it every day, and I've sort of played around with how I'm doing it in terms of writing or talking about it. I've done sort of more intentional 21-day programs, for example, and what I do now is pretty simple. It's actually like a Huberman protocol. We're shocked. We both
Nice.
we both love Huberman. But as part of a few things that I write down each morning before I get started at work, I write down 5 things that I'm grateful for. And some days it just rolls out of me. Like I can't stop writing. I'm grateful for so many things. And sometimes it's harder and it's like, okay, I'm grateful for my coffee this morning or getting my kids out the door on time. Like sometimes it's harder. But I think there's been so many studies that have shown that if you actually do feel grateful, it's going to improve all aspects of your health, like your sleep, your mood. There's been studies that have proven your immunity can be improved from gratitude practice. And of course, decreases like depression and anxiety and even your risk of disease. So when I read all that, I'm like, well, there's nothing that should be stopping me from doing this every day. And I do actually find since I've started doing it I guess I've been doing it a couple of years now, it's hard to rattle me now. Like
Interesting.
it
So you've
really is.
noticed that change because you've been doing it for a while. If you've been doing it for a couple of years, that's significantly better than me.
I have I almost never get annoyed. If someone cuts me off, my immediate reaction is they must be in a hurry. They need
Yeah.
to get somewhere. That's fine. If something crappy happens to me during the day and someone like was rude to me in a store, I'm like, they must be having a harder day than I am. Like
Yeah.
it's really sort of shifted my mindset to let go of things and focus on the positive things.
Yeah.
And it probably makes sense, right? Because it releases oxytocin, which is the love hormone, and it's supposed to make you like a happier person.
Yeah. Yeah. And with it, I mean, one thing that I struggled with, and this is going to sound really bad, but if you ever sat down to do gratitude and nothing comes to mind, and you're just like,
Yep.
I don't know what I'm grateful for, but I allowed myself to just have like repeating gratitudes day after day can be the exact same thing, and that's totally fine. When you start to look for it, I think there's so much power in like looking for the parts of gratitude. And sometimes we may not have a deal on our plate or something like that, but we got a roof over our head. And I mean, if we're listening to a podcast or watching a podcast on YouTube, we have access to internet and we have potentially a smartphone. Like these are things that the majority of the world doesn't necessarily have. And so there's a lot of very small things that I think we take for granted that can definitely be elements of gratitude.
100%.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you can even look at, I mean, gratitude sort of ties into this other concept, but like deliberate comparison sometimes, like leaning into that fact that, okay, I have internet today and I know that lots of people in this world don't have it. I'm deliberately comparing myself to that person's position and turning it into a gratitude for my own. And that can even help your mindset, right?
Totally.
Gratitude in that moment that you have the opportunity that maybe somebody doesn't. And if you harness that, you can sort of apply it in this flywheel effect to the rest of your day.
Totally. It reminds me of Tim Ferriss has this thing that he calls, I think it's called fear setting. That might not be accurate, where he says it's important. I think it's like once a week or once a month. You just think about what it would be like to be like homeless and have nothing. And yeah. And he says that, I think it's a Stoic philosophy, or he's very into Stoicism, of course. And there's something about the Stoic philosophy of like realizing how you actually have a lot by picturing worst case scenario. And he calls that fear setting or something, but that's kind of what's coming to mind for me there. Have you ever, there's this interesting Russian proverb of a farmer who meets a genie, and this genie grants this farmer one wish. And this farmer says, for my one wish, my neighbor has a cow, and I would like my one wish to be to kill the neighbor's cow. And that to me is like social comparison at its finest, where you don't want a cow, you just want your neighbor to not have a cow. And this is the concept of envy. And there's this guy that I follow on Twitter. He's really, really good. His name's George Mack. He posted a very interesting thread recently on envy. And one of his equations that he had was happiness equals quality of life minus envy. And if you think about that equation for a while, like your quality of life goes up, but if your envy goes up in I guess proportion to that, your happiness doesn't improve. And theoretically, if your quality of life stays the same, but your envy goes down, your happiness goes up. So it's kind of an interesting equation to sit with, that happiness equals quality of life minus envy. And I find that to be pretty powerful. And where we honestly end up feeling a lot of despair, I think sometimes, is when we're starting to scroll on social media. But you also brought up a really important point here, which is sometimes like we don't ever have the full story.
No.
And it's almost like every social media post should have some sort of fine print attached to it that says, this person is likely not as successful or as happy as they appear in this image or video. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, well, totally. It totally is. And it's even like this, like, he said this in his Twitter post too. He said, like, if you see somebody and let's say that they're taking a selfie or something and they're in public and they're taking a selfie and they're kind of doing all these different angles and making different faces, you think to yourself, wow, that's not that cool. That's kind of sad in a sense, right? But then when you see it online, you're like, oh, look how happy and successful and how perfect that person looks. And he's like, if you just like zoom out for a second, he says, zoom out, look at how the sausage is made here. You have this like perfectly doctored image of somebody on vacation, but it took 30 shots of them doing different poses and different angles in order to get that. And when you kind of zoom out on this as a whole, I think we just changes our perspective on it all.
Absolutely. And I mean, when it comes to real estate, like there's sometimes you find the most successful real estate agents aren't even posting anything online, right? Because they don't have time. They're doing deals or they've hired someone to handle their social media for them. So it's like, I know I'm kind of changing the subject, but bringing it back to the real estate, it's like, it's really hard to get an understanding of somebody's production by looking at their social media account.
Well, and I can say this just from working with agents for years and years. It's never the way that it appears on social. Never. And some of the like most successful agents that I've encountered deal with circumstances mentally and anguish that I wouldn't wish on anybody. And some of these people are doing production like north of 2 million GCI, and they want nothing more than to do less production because of what it's doing to the quality of their life, the quality of their relationships. And we think to ourselves, oh, well, that just seems like, you know, a very privileged sort of feeling, but it's still a feeling that they have. And regardless of that production level, that goalpost is always going to change. If it's production that you're after, that goalpost always changes. And I do think it's important for folks with real estate on their mind when they're thinking of social comparison from a real estate standpoint. Like your production, we've said this before, your production does not have any sort of correlation on your self-worth as an individual. You can sell 0 homes and be in the industry for 20 years and not sell 1 home, and your self-worth is still the same as anybody else out there. And so this is also why I think it's important for us as real estate agents, in a sense, to get away from real estate and to have interests and to have passions outside of real estate and things we want to improve outside of real estate. Maybe this is health, maybe this is kids, right? I'm not saying that just for this purpose, go and have a child, but I'm saying there's so many things in life where we can derive purpose and growth from that's not just tied to a production number. And I think it's important for us as real estate agents to have those interests.
And when you're an agent, because you're self-employed, because you are the driver of the business, it's so easy to tie up your self-image and your self-esteem and your self-worth into your career, right? Someone asks you about yourself, the first thing you say is, you're a real estate agent. Well, who else are you? And I think you're nailing that on the head, to sort of focus on the other things that make you you, right? So you're not just so consumed by your career, because it's not something you can turn off in this business.
It's not, but it's interesting because, you know, if we think back to like previous generations, and maybe this isn't the way that it went, but I feel like back in previous generations, career was a part of your life. It wasn't like your whole life. And I find now in like the modern day and age, career is like everything. It's like everything to everybody, and it occupies all their time, and it feels like it's more competitive. Where back in the day, when people did theoretically, statistically have higher happiness levels, more satisfaction with their lives, yet they didn't make nearly as much or push nearly as hard. And I think this kind of grind mentality can take away a lot of the potential pleasures that life has to offer.
Yeah, and I guess part of it is probably just the nature of the economy and the world at large now. It used to be one breadwinner could support a family and,
Yeah.
you could have one person at home if you had kids, but that's very different now. And I guess it feels probably a lot for the young people that are starting out in this career is like they're up against more than perhaps their predecessors were. It's like it's harder to save for a down payment. It's harder to get more deals under your belt. It's harder to earn enough money to buy the car that you have to drive your clients around. Like everything kind of feels, I guess, unsurmountable at some points, just because the cost of living is so much higher. And of course the commissions are higher as housing prices have risen,
Yep.
but there's also more real estate agents. So again, coming back to the scarcity mindset, it can be overwhelming, I think, for newer real estate agents coming into
It can. Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I always try to tell myself is whenever I say the words, I will be happy when, whenever I say that, I will be happy when, that's where I know there's some level of comparison or envy, or I need to get to some place, and then my self-worth and happiness is going to kick in. But until that point is reached, it's not going to be there. As soon as it's I'll be happy when, this kind of hedonic adaptation where we're always looking for the next thing, that's usually my moment where I'm like, okay, let's stop for a second here. Obsessive passion, we need for something else. Like the obsessive passion, oftentimes just like one track mind focus on something, oftentimes does lead to, I think, a lower degree of self-esteem, because you're just obsessively passionate and everything is tied to this one thing. And in reality, life has a number of dimensions to it.
It sure does. It's funny you say that because I had a big milestone birthday recently, as you know, and like I wrote out a bunch of things I'd want to teach my kids. And one of them was life is now. It's not when or if. And you have to focus on living your life in the moment rather, and that's cliche, but rather than focusing on this big goal that when you climb this hill, you're going to feel a different way, because you won't. And you talk to a lot of really successful entrepreneurs who have, let's say, made millions of dollars selling a company. Their happiness level changes, but then person after person relates, actually, then I just felt like, what's next? What's next? They're standing on a bigger mountain of cash maybe, but they also have that when or if feeling, right? So I think you have to just accept that it's part of being human, but also understand that like people are really adaptable. Have you ever, maybe you can relate to this, but it's happened to me every single time. When I first bought my first place, I moved into this 1-bedroom loft and I was so excited. It was my own. I was living by myself. I owned my first place. I was like, this is great. I'm happy here. I'll never need more. And then I was able to buy the next bigger place. And I moved in and I thought, wow, okay, this place is over 1,000 square feet. I'm never going to need more space than that. You keep moving on. And now, I'm in a detached, pretty big house. And I still feel to myself, okay, well, when I have my next house, I'll have room for this and that. It's like, you adapt to your environment.
You know what? I'm laughing right now for a number of reasons, but because it's so much relates to our career in real estate. How you're touching on this with real estate, I could not agree more. And we see it all the time. All of us see it all the time in our clients, right? We see them wanting to, upsize, or and we're like, really? Like, why do you need 4,000 square feet? But as humans, like, we're so adaptable. And I think we're so adaptable to just quote unquote improvements in life and also setbacks. Like humans, like we've evolved to adapt in so many ways. And so when you get the bigger house, it's kind of like winning the lottery. You get the house, you get the keys, you're immediately excited. And then, a couple weeks goes by and you're like, yeah, I still really like my house, but I'm used to it. It's kind of like the new car phenomenon too, right? You can't wait to get that new car. You get the new car and then you're kind of like, it's just a car. And the funny thing is I think this happens at any level of house value, whether your house is, 200,000 to like 20 million. It doesn't matter. Eventually you're just used to your $20 million house and you start looking at, well, I wonder if I could put in a helicopter pad on this next one. It can't really get, like this. It's just how we're built. It's not like that there is any, there is no finish line, I think. And I think if we can fall in love with just the nature of life and the ups and downs of it, it takes away this need for us to get to the next level. But there's an opposing side to this, which I think probably most people deal with. I do as well, which is this concept of, okay, well, and I'd love to know your thoughts on it. I look to somebody else. I feel a level of inspiration. I'd love to be able to get there. If I got rid of that feeling, would my motivation all disappear? Like if I was just always happy with where I am at that point in time, isn't what like drove humans forward was the
Yes.
fact that we always wanted to be somewhat better. We always wanted to be better. And there's this tug of war between this concept of gratitude and wanting to get to the next place. And I find that tricky for myself personally. That's not something that I have totally figured out. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think both can be true. I think you
Yeah.
can be really grateful for all you have and all you've learned and the journey that you've been on. But I think you can also strive for more. And that doesn't necessarily mean more material things. You know that saying, like, first you own your stuff and then your stuff owns
Yeah.
you. It's like the desire for more is a disease, right? And we all have it. So it can be more income, it can be more friends, it can be more stuff, a bigger house, what have you. I think that's human, and those of us that are driven by that motor are probably the people listening to this podcast who are self-employed real estate agents who, want to get bigger commission checks and continue to improve and evolve. But it's like, how do you harness that, and how do you turn it into a motivation while also remaining grateful? I think it's a daily practice, but I
Yeah.
think that both things are true.
Yeah, I think that's actually absolutely correct. They're not mutually exclusive here. They can both be true at the same time. And having a little bit of inspiration on where you want to get to. But I also think that there's just, and you brought this up earlier on, there's only a couple of things that we can control. And generally that's our behavior and our perspective. Like we can't control other people. We can control our behavior and our perspective. And we can use that as a source of inspiration by wishing them well and then being inspired to go on a similar path without comparing ourselves and feeling envious towards them. That's definitely possible. It's not easy to do, but I think it is very, very possible.
I think one of the easiest, well, it's not easy, it's hard to put yourself out there, but a trick that you could try if you're sort of feeling this way, envious about somebody else or wishing that you could do something the way that they're doing it, reach out to them and talk to them about it. Like, I think lots of people are scared of the reach out, but go and ask that person, hey, I really admire your YouTube videos, for example. Like, how did you get started? Or, would you be willing to share like a quick tip for me? Here's what I'm most curious about. Like, be specific, don't have a general ask. But if you reach out to that person and treat them as an expert, the person's probably going to feel super flattered that somebody is wanting to be mentored or to learn from them. They're probably going to give you the information. And then in turn, like, pay it forward, right? There's probably someone who feels like they're not up to your level in some way that you could perhaps benefit. So like look around in your life and be that person that people can feel like they can call on if they have a question. And I think if you live in that mindset of like wanting to help others and also improve yourself, it's like the concept of rising tides raise all ships, right? If everybody is trying to improve themselves, like the industry as a whole will be better, your business will be better, and you'll feel better as a person.
You know what's really shocking about that too is just like there is so much that agents and people just in general can basically harness just by asking.
Yeah.
You're most of us are never going to ask for something or reach out to somebody and say, hey, really loved what you did here. Can you tell me a little bit about it? And same thing in real estate, like we're not going to reach out to that builder because we don't want to get rejected. And there's so much that stands like for success on the other side of just asking. And most of the time we're going to be pleasantly surprised. And I've heard this from like even very, very successful people that have gotten there. Oftentimes when you hear their stories, they're just like, you say, take me back to day one as a real estate agent. And they're just like, well, I just like tried to contact as many people as I possibly could, stayed in touch with them. I wasn't afraid to let them know that I was in real estate and ask them for potential business. And that's kind of how they built it. There's nobody who has, I had this like amazing mailer campaign and that just blew up my business. And then from then on, or I ran this perfect social media ad campaign, which drove a ton of leads, and these leads were all perfect. It's never that. It's these people, they're just willing to go out, talk to more people, talk about real estate. That's generally how like a lot of top producers build their business. There's no like secret ad formula that's going to cause your business to take off.
And I think most people are looking for that secret formula, but you're right. It's just effort. I think there were some studies recently done, and I wish I could remember the name of the scientists that were doing it, but they did this study on sort of exceptional humans, and they were looking at athletes and business people, and they went back to their childhood and they asked their peers or people that knew them growing up, could you tell that this person was exceptional? Like, were they Tiger Woods, who at 2 was swinging this golf club like an absolute pro? And in almost most or all cases, the answer was no. What separated that individual from becoming exceptional later in life wasn't just like sheer talent, but it was just effort and practice. And I think if you were to go to your real estate hero that you admire and you're asking this question of how did you get started or how do you make these amazing YouTube videos, I think you'd realize exactly what you said. Like, the person has just put in the time and the effort, and where they started and where they are now are two very different things. And it's a way of like humanizing our heroes, right? It's like you'll probably realize in that conversation that that person also has struggles, or that person also has tried and failed at things, and everybody starts somewhere. And so understanding that we're all just people trying to get better, I think is a really good way to look at it.
And it also like puts motivation behind learning, I feel like. And that's really that and I see this in real estate all the time. Like, agents will come in and they'll say, and there's a few that come to mind specifically right now, that will come in and they say to me, well, I don't have an SOI. I'm new to this city. I don't know a lot of people. And generally the response is going to be, okay, well, A, don't compare yourself to that person who has lived in the city for years and years and it's just getting started. They might have some traction initially. You may not have that traction initially. Prepare for that. But when you look at that agent after 5 years, it's shocking to see that the agents that just put in the effort will almost always rise to the top. They'll outpace that person who starts with a lot of production. They may have some, and I've seen this. I've seen agents start with massive production, like 30 to 40 deals like year one. And then after 5 years, they like fall off the cliff. They're gone, or their production just stagnates or starts to slowly drop after they've kind of basically gone through their whole SOI. Their production starts to decrease. And then there's these agents that prioritize learning and improvement. How do I get better at this career? How do I get better at connecting with people? How do I connect with more people? And they start with 0 SOI, don't know anybody. And within 5 years, they're producing at an extremely high level. And it's just because they've prioritized learning, where the other one just kind of sat back and was like, wow, this career is pretty easy. I did a bunch of deals my first year. Doesn't stay that way. It definitely doesn't stay that way. So I really like what you're saying here, because I think it really prioritizes the importance of learning and improvement.
And improvement. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
What else is on your list?
exactly. One kind of final thing that this doesn't really end on a good note on my part, but I still think it's worthwhile to bring this up. But there was an interesting study around suicide rates, and those rates are astronomically high in the millionaire plus category, which kind of leads us to believe, like, what's happening here at this level potentially. And I think a lot of it is driven by the hedonic adaptation and this concept that once you end up associating yourself with other people who potentially have more than you, it doesn't matter what that number is, whether it's 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, you eventually want to be a billionaire. Like, it always kind of continues. And I think that oftentimes we look at other people and we basically overrate their happiness and then we underrate our own. And really, like, if somebody's on Instagram shouting about how successful they are, just an easy mental model is cut that in half. And if somebody's very humble and not saying much about their success, double it. So really, how loud people are about their success, you can tell a lot. You can tell a lot about it. So if you're comparing yourself to somebody who's, driving their rented Lamborghini and they're the crypto king and all sorts of things like that, you can probably cut their success in half, as well as their happiness and satisfaction. And then you have kind of the standard person who's just living their life. You can probably double their success and happiness.
One exercise I like to do with agents, and it kind of ties in here too, is figuring out why. Like, why are you working so hard? What are you working for? I think there's very few people, and I've talked to lots of people about this, who can answer the question, what will you do when you're rich? Like, if that's what you're trying to do,
Yeah.
because most agents have this goal, right, of this audacious commission check that they want to hit, or this level of production. So it goes back to the when or if. So when you get there, then what? What is this life going to allow you to do? And I don't think enough people have it clearly spelled out. Like, you need to, I think, understand what specifically your perfect day looks like, what specifically your family life looks like. Like, your problems are not going to change. In fact, sometimes they get more complex. Like, the more production you do and the higher income that you have, and, more money, more problems is often actually true. But like, what is it going to bring you? And I think asking yourself that question and understanding the answer is key. Like, maybe you are someone who's just so truly passionate about real estate, it will allow you to do more deals. And that's great. But I don't think that everybody feels that way. Most people, I think, have interests or passions that they would want to explore should they reach a certain height. And like, what are they? Like, I encourage people, write it out. I think writing things down is important.
I love that. And I would say ask yourself then what 5 times. So you say, okay, I get my $1 million in the bank. Okay, then what? Then I get this house. Okay, then what? And the reason I say that is comes back to another parable, which is that Fisherman and the Businessman, which people have probably heard of. If you haven't, basically there's a fisherman who goes out half the day, fishes, brings the fish back home. He's very good at it, eats fish with his family. And he encounters this businessman. This businessman says, well, why don't you just fish for the whole day? And then you can bring back more fish and sell the remainder. And he says, okay, and then what? He says, well, then you'd have more money. You could hire another fisherman to join you and you can start to build out a fleet. And he says, and then what? And he says, well, then you build up this fleet to be something large and you can sell it. And he says, and then what? He says, then you sell it and then you go back to fishing for half the day for your family and enjoying the rest of the day. And so it's kind of this circular parable, of course, right? Where you come back to the fact that like, why are you doing it? And there's a lot of times with agents, it's not always just being high producing. And in fact, even to make it personal, my wife, Wilhelmina, like when I ask her, like, why do you sell real estate? She says, well, I enjoy it, but I like that it affords me flexibility throughout the day. I like that it affords me a flexible career that I can do different things. And she's like, if I was producing all the time, she would really dislike her life, but she just likes the amount of production she does and doesn't really have a need to increase that at a dramatic rate because she really, really values the flexibility that it provides. Just kind of different perspective.
I love how self-aware she is too to say that, right? Like, I don't think there's many people at her level and her caliber that necessarily would say, I actually don't want to do more deals. But it's actually for her, she has power in the transaction numbers that she's doing and the lifestyle that it affords her. And that I think is the point that we all should aspire to get to, is like knowing when's enough so that you can actually spend the rest of your time doing the things that you love.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it also just helps keep a North Star for her, right? Like she's like, oh, I could run this new campaign that's going to cost $10K a month. And then, so it's like, okay, and then what? Well, then you get more business. Okay. And then what? Well, then you're going to have to give up some of your hobbies because your production's going to be higher. Are you okay with that trade-off? No, not at all. So then she saves the money, doesn't get the same amount of business, but happy as can be to not have additional business beyond that. So I think that it's worth thinking as a real estate agent that we all should have different goals. Our goal isn't always to be the highest producer in a given market. Our goal can be to live a really good life, and real estate can help us do that.
Love that.
Love it. Okay. Thank you very much for watching or listening. Remember, you can reach out anytime at revrealestateschool.com. Jess, thanks again for coming on. This is such a great, important topic that hopefully agents will see some value in.